Hey, hi, hello, how you doing? Today we are going to be talking about how to write the first chapter of your story. The first chapter of your book is what can make or break a story. It is the reader's very first impression of your book and what they can expect from the other 400 or so pages that are within your novel. That means that you need to make a good first impression. And not only does that put pressure on you, but writing the first chapter is known to be hard. Especially as a beginner writer, it is incredibly hard to get the first chapter right. And even more experienced veteran writers will do draft after draft after draft of that first chapter. And while I can't make the process easy, I can give you some tips on how to make the experience a little bit easier by giving you some pointers on things to look for and implement in your first chapter. The first thing that you want to implement in your first chapter is the basics. Who is our protagonist? Who is our narrator? And whose point of view are we reading from? What is the setting? What year are we in? Are we in a fictional world or are we in the real world? Introduce us to the main players of your story, or at least as many of them as possible. What their relationships are to our main character, to our narrator, to the point of view character. Give us a clear idea of what their relationships are to the main character and how it shows itself. Are they more playful with the main character? Are they very standoffish? Are they only within each other's proximity because they have to be for some dumb family function? Are they sisters who still make digs at each other the same way that they would have when they were 14? These tiny things tell us a lot about the players as well as the main character and your narrator in just a simple conversation or a couple of sentences. The setting also can be really important when it comes to reeling in your readers. An interesting setting means that the reader is going to want to know more. Especially if you are writing a fantasy, the first few chapters can be really used to introduce your reader to the world that they are in, especially if you don't have something like a map. That means that it can get a little bit info dumpy, but if you do it right, because you always should avoid info dumping as much as possible, you can truly reel your reader in by just describing the setting that they are in. When it comes to novels that are in the thriller genre or contemporary or anything that is more set in our world, things that we are familiar with, and then I'm not talking about settings like post-apocalypse, then I'm talking about if you were to look outside right now, that kind of setting, it might be less important to go into all of the details, and you might maybe want to spend some more time on your characters rather than your setting, but it is still important to establish, because even with those types of settings, readers have preferences, and the reader might decide when reading about your setting, maybe this is not something I want to read about right now. And that might sound like a negative thing, but let's say that the reader pushed through anyway and read the book now, not knowing the setting isn't really what they want to read about. They might give the book 3 stars in the end. If they now waited for like a month until they were looking for something with that setting, they might give the book a 4 or maybe even a 5. So these standard things are incredibly important to give an idea about. Now, that doesn't mean that you immediately have to reveal everything. Your reader is supposed to learn more as they read the story. But the basics as to who your characters are, where they are, is important to talk about. On that note, the second thing you're going to want to establish is your main character's current daily life before the inciting incident. We want to have something that we can compare the character's life to before it completely falls into ruin. If we immediately have the inciting incident from sentence 1 without being able to establish this is our character and this is what they live like, If we have the inciting incident, let's say from sentence 1, and we don't have time to establish this is our main character, this is who we're going to be following throughout the story, and this is what their life currently is like, the inciting incident will not be as impactful or powerful as it might have been. It gives us something to compare the character situation with once their life has fallen into ruin. It shows the effect of everything that the character goes through throughout the course of the story. As the story goes on, your character will be more and more removed from the life that they once had. A life that most likely they are longing to return to compared to what they have now. Especially, and again I'm going to use fantasy books here because I think they're a great example when it comes to this. Your character may often be forced to flee from their homeland, may be more wandering from place to place to place, whether that be to avoid persecution or because they are trying to overthrow the kingdom, whatever. Most likely, they will be forced to go away from their home, from the people that they love, and everything of the sort. If we did not know what this character's life looked like before, that it was still semi-peaceful even with some problems that were going on most likely, we will not feel as deeply for the character later on when they might be having a moment of, I want to go home, I want my life to go back to the way that it was, I am done, I'm at the end of my rope, I feel like I can't do this anymore. Because every character eventually gets to that point that they're like,
I'm done, I want to go home, I don't want to do this anymore, why me? I was just trying to live a peaceful life and all of a sudden I'm doing this.
So you're going to want to establish what their life currently looks like. What is their job? What are their relationships like? What does their home life look like? What are their current struggles? What are things that they draw joy out of? And if it's possible, this is just a little fun extra, does your character already know the villain? If they do, let's say this is someone from their social circle or somebody who is well known, like some type of royalty or somebody who has a high status in the community or just in their country, if we know who the villain is, if they know who the villain is, the reader should too. It completely changes what that relationship dynamic looks like, and it can avoid a little bit of a plot hole when it comes to their relationship. Because if you as the author know these two know each other, but you don't tell that to the reader, but then there isn't an official first meeting between the main character and the villain, you're gonna kind of leave readers confused. Establishing these things also just gives more information about who our main character is. It gives us an insight into why we should care about these characters. Why should we care about the life that they lost after the inciting incident, after the events of the book started, and now that we are in the middle of the book? Why should we care that the character is struggling with not having their old life? I mean, if we haven't established that, who says that their life before wasn't horrible? Who says that the life they have now, despite everything that's going on, isn't actually better than the life that they left behind? Who's to say? And you can also do the same thing, if not in as much detail, with some of the side characters, as long as it directly ties in with the main character. It gives the story and all the characters more depth than what you had before. Now that doesn't mean that this should take chapters upon chapters upon chapters to do this. And it may take a few chapters, like let's say 2 chapters or so, to properly do this, and most likely quite a few drafts, but it is still important to do. It doesn't all need to happen within the first chapter, especially because we're going to get to know the characters more as the story goes on. But the first chapter is a good place to start because it also gives the reader immediately an opportunity to bond with the main character. If the main character is very similar to the reader in certain ways, you're immediately going to give the reader a chance to pick up on that. Those two might bond immediately, and your reader is going to want to keep reading. Now, the next one is optional, and that is your actual inciting incident. The inciting incident should happen at least in the first few chapters of your book. Some books have it in the first chapter. Other books have it started at the end of chapter 1 and continue on into chapter 2. Or they have it in chapter 2 and continue on in chapter 3. Now, as I said, this is different for every book, and not every book is meant to have their inciting incident in the first chapter. Sometimes there are too many things that you need to be able to set up first before you can jump into the inciting incident. So if you feel it is important to, for example, talk about your character's job first, but you need chapter 1 for that and it doesn't leave room for the inciting incident anymore, your inciting incident should move to chapter 2. However, it should happen as soon as possible after setting up those basics for us to know what is going on in the story. As soon as we know this is where we're currently at, these are our main players, this is where we are, and we have all of that necessary information to understand, okay, this is where we're at, here's a solid base, your inciting incident should follow. Some people might actually use something like a prologue to set up more of these basics. Like, for example, the main story is the character at 20 years old, but we get the introduction to the characters and to the world in the prologue when the character is like 5 or 6. That means that the inciting incident can then fall in chapter 1. We don't immediately in a prologue expect things like the inciting incident because we know these things often happen in a different time period or long before the inciting incident, or is even told from a different perspective than the actual main character. So we don't necessarily expect that in something like a prologue. So that is something to think about if that is something that is right for your story, and if it might allow for your inciting incident to fall into chapter 1, it is especially something to be thinking about. Now, whether the inciting incident actually falls within the first chapter also depends on how long your chapters are. Books that have chapters that are 20 to 25 pages have a much bigger chance than books that have chapters that are like 2, 3, maybe 4 pages long. That it is much more likely that the inciting incident will fall in like chapter 4 or chapter 5. So if your inciting incident does not fall within the first chapter, don't panic. There are a couple of things that could be the cause, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to 100% find a way to get it into chapter 1. Some of the best books that I know of have the inciting incident in chapter 4 or 5. Especially if you are writing something like a fantasy book. There's a lot to set up, there's a lot to establish, much more than something like a contemporary or a thriller. There's so much that you need to set up. You need to explain a whole magic system. You need to talk about who rules the country, what is their reign like, etc., etc. With a thriller, we don't need a bunch of information on King Charles. So if you can get it into chapter 1, I'd say look into getting it into chapter 1. So let's say that you can't get into chapter 1. How do you keep your readers to keep reading until the inciting incident? There are a couple of ways to do that. The most important part then is to create intrigue. You're gonna want to give your reader something to make up for the fact that the inciting incident is a few more pages ahead. For some people, that means an action scene. Again, fantasy often has first chapters that involve a fight scene or something similar. It starts off with two characters fighting or training in some arena. You can also decide to play a little bit with the setting. If your inciting incident is not going to be in chapter 1, put your characters in chapter 1 somewhere that is maybe a little unexpected, or somewhere that there's a lot to talk about. There's a lot to show the reader, something that they can get excited about. Or maybe you can give a twist or a turn in the very first chapter that the reader might not be expecting. So let's say that the first chapter starts off kind of slow, two characters are talking while walking through the woods. So they're walking through the woods, everything is fine. And all of a sudden, they get ambushed by God knows who. And the person that the main character was talking to dies. It may not be the inciting incident, but it can be a hint towards what is maybe going on in the world that the characters are living in. Maybe this is a much more common occurrence than would be in our world today. Maybe they were going out hunting for deer and instead they get attacked by a massive black bear. Make it something unexpected. This is something that is going to get your readers' adrenaline up. This is something that's going to keep your readers engaged. And it's going to immediately show that the author means business. This author is already telling you you're going to need to keep your guard up when reading my books, because I'm going to keep catching you off guard like that. And it's immediately going to pique your reader's attention. You can also decide to work more with the characters. If your inciting incident is not there yet, but you feel like your character is somebody who the reader should really connect to before that happens, you're going to want to spend some more time with them. So let's say, and this is a bit of a cliche, but it's the first thing that I can think of right now. Your character, your main character, is a motivational speaker. Maybe the first chapter can be them giving some kind of a speech or having a discussion about a topic that a lot of your readers will be able to relate to, like for example your mental health. And especially if you can then tie something like that back to the actual plot, that's an even bigger bonus. If your reader is connected to the character early on, that means that they're going to want to keep reading, even when there is maybe like a dip in the story, let's say halfway through, or just at any point throughout the story that the reader is less interested. They're still going to want to keep reading because from very early on you established why the reader should care, why this is an interesting character, why we're gonna want to know more, even if the plot isn't moving forward as fast right now as it was 50 pages ago. And last but not least, you're gonna give clear expectations. Your reader is gonna want to know what they can expect, and that is something that we're gonna want to know from chapter 1. The number one thing that I hate in a book and is instantly going to make me DNF it is if we get clear expectations from chapter 1, like this is what's going to happen throughout the story, and then halfway through or 3/4 of your way through, you just throw all of those expectations out of the window. I absolutely hate that. And I am thinking of one specific book right now that even 5-6 years later, I barely remember the plot of it anymore, but that book did exactly that. I was loving it. I was gonna give it 5 stars. 3/4 of the way through, all of those expectations out of the window. Plot completely changed out of nowhere, and I was done. I was absolutely done. If the whole premise of the book, what you read on the back, is they have to find their sibling, the book can end once they find their sibling. If you want to continue the story from there, give me a sequel. But I don't want to read another 200 pages about something completely unrelated. I don't want to find that sibling at page 200 and then the sibling would be like, No, wait. We still have to do this, and then we can go home. I expect, when I am being told the whole book is going to be about finding the sibling, I expect the whole book to be about that. And your first chapter is going to help solidify those expectations that were already set by what the reader read on the back of the book. Those two together are going to tell your reader, this is what you're going to read about. So you need to be clear in that first chapter of what your reader can expect, and don't deviate from it. If you do deviate from it, that needs to be established in the first chapter or the back of the book as well, but I'm going to focus on the first chapter now, obviously, of this is also where we're headed, and let the reader decide from there. Give hints that this more unexpected thing is also going to come up, and don't hide it until it's there. That is not what the reader signed up for. And even if in the end it is still something that your reader might enjoy, they're going to be pissed about the fact that it's not what they signed up for. And you might actually piss off your reader to the point where they're like, you know what, I don't want to read about this, I'm moving on to something else. Where if you had set that expectation of this is also going to come up, or this is also a theme that's going to be talked about, or this is also going to be an important part of the book, if the reader had that expectation, they might have pushed through, they might have finished the whole book and be like, I really enjoyed that. Whereas if you had set that expectation of this might also come up, this is also a theme that we're going to be discussing, this is also going to be talked about, your reader might not have only pushed through, but actually enjoyed what they read because they knew, hey, this might be something that's going to come up. This again can extend to like the first couple of chapters, but again should at least be discussed, established in the first few chapters of your book, starting at chapter 1. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos, and I will see you all next Saturday. Bye bye!